Ghost bus to hell. The rain was relentless, each drop an icy dagger piercing through John's thin jacket. He huddled deeper into the meager shelter of the bus stop, the rusted metal roof groaning under the onslaught. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping the rain into a frenzy and sending shivers down his spine. He cursed his luck. Of all the nights to miss the train, it had to be this one, a night when even the stray dogs had sought refuge from the storm. Oakhaven was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business. And everyone knew about the night bus. Old Man Hemmings, with his perpetually stained overalls and missing teeth, swore it was driven by a creature straight out of hellfire, its eyes burning like hot coals. Mrs. Gable, the librarian with her perpetually pursed lips and disapproving stare, claimed the bus only appeared when someone was about to shuffle off this mortal coil. John usually scoffed at those stories, dismissing them as the ramblings of bored old folks. But tonight, with the wind howling and the rain lashing down, those stories seemed to creep into his bones, chilling him to the core. He glanced at his watch, the luminous hands barely visible in the gloom. Almost midnight. He'd been waiting for over an hour, his hope dwindling with each passing minute. He considered walking, but Elmwood was miles away, and the thought of navigating those dark, deserted roads in this weather was enough to make his stomach churn. Just as he was about to give up and seek shelter in the abandoned gas station across the street, a pair of headlights pierced through the rain-soaked darkness. The screech of brakes echoed through the night, sending a flock of crows scattering from the nearby trees. The bus, a hulking behemoth of rusted metal and cracked windows, lurched to a halt in front of him, its engine sputtering like a dying beast. The doors hissed open, revealing an interior bathed in a sickly yellow light that seemed to flicker with an unnatural rhythm. A wave of stale, musty air washed over him, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and something vaguely metallic. Like dried blood, John hesitated, his gut churning with unease. The bus looked like it had been salvaged from a junkyard, and the driver, a gaunt figure with deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb the light, looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. Just get on with it, John, he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible above the storm. He stepped onto the bus, the floor cold and damp beneath his worn sneakers. The driver, without a word, gestured towards the fare box. John fumbled for his wallet, his fingers clumsy with cold. "One ticket to Elmwood," he said, his voice echoing in the unsettling silence of the bus. The driver's lips barely moved, his voice a low growl. $2. John paid and slumped into a seat near the front, his body weary and his mind filled with a growing sense of dread. He glanced around. There were only two other passengers, a woman shrouded in a thick black veil, sitting alone at the back, and an elderly man with a gnarled cane huddled in a seat across the aisle, his head bowed and his shoulders slumped. As the bus pulled away from the curb, John noticed something strange. The windows were completely fogged up, obscuring the outside world. He tried to wipe them clean with his sleeve, but the condensation returned instantly, thicker than before. Fantastic, he thought. Now I'm trapped in a mobile sauna with a creepy driver and two potential axe murderers. He tried to distract himself by checking his phone. But as expected, there was no signal. He sighed, a feeling of isolation washing over him. He was trapped, cut off from the world, at the mercy of this strange bus and its even stranger occupants. The bus rattled on, the silence broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the wipers, the driver's low, guttural cough, and the occasional groan of the engine. John felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. This was no ordinary bus ride. This was something else, something sinister. He could feel it in his bones. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The bus rumbled on, seemingly forever, through the endless rain and darkness. John had no idea how long they had been driving, his watch having stopped sometime earlier. The scenery outside, or what little he could see of it through the fogged-up windows, remained unchanged, a blur of dark shapes and swirling mist. The old man across the aisle shifted in his seat, his head snapping up. He started muttering, his voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to slither through the air. John strained to hear, but the words were unintelligible. A jumble of sounds that sent chills down his spine. He glanced at the veiled woman. She hadn't moved an inch, her face still hidden behind the thick black fabric. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him, her unseen eyes boring into him. Suddenly, the bus lurched violently, the tires screeching as the driver slammed on the brakes. John was thrown forward, his head cracking against the seat in front of him. He heard a gasp from the back of the bus, followed by a low moan from the old man. "What the hell was that?" John exclaimed, rubbing his head. The driver remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his expression unreadable. The bus lurched back into motion, picking up speed as it plunged deeper into the darkness. The whispering started again, louder this time, a chorus of voices swirling around John's head. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling, filled with malice and despair. It was as if the very air around him was alive with the whispers of the dead. He felt a cold dread creeping into his heart, a sense of impending doom that he couldn't shake off. He tried to rationalize his fear, telling himself it was just the storm, the late hour, the unsettling atmosphere of the bus. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something was terribly wrong. He was trapped in a nightmare. And it was only getting worse. The rain finally subsided, the downpour easing into a light drizzle. As the bus slowed, John noticed that the fog on the windows was beginning to dissipate. He peered out, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. What he saw made his blood run cold. The landscape outside was like nothing he had ever seen before. Gone were the familiar rolling hills and lush green fields of Oakhaven. In their place was a desolate wasteland, a barren expanse of cracked earth and twisted, skeletal trees that clawed at the sky like the fingers of the damned. A thick, eerie mist clung to the ground, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. In the distance, he could make out the silhouette of a city, but it was unlike any city he had ever seen. The buildings were grotesque, misshapen structures that seemed to writhe and pulsate in the dim light. Like living organisms, the city seemed to exude an aura of decay and death, a chilling testament to some ancient, forgotten evil. The whispering intensified, the voices swirling around him like a vortex of fear. their icy breath chilling him to the bone. He felt a cold hand grip his arm, its touch sending a jolt of terror through him. He looked down. It was the old man. His eyes wide with terror. His skin pale and clammy. "We're not alone," the old man wheezed, his voice a dry rattle. "They're here." John followed the old man's gaze. He saw them then. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, moving in the mist outside the bus. They were humanoid in shape. But there was something profoundly wrong about them. Their limbs were elongated and distorted. Their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were pale and gaunt. Their eyes burning with an unnatural light that seemed to pierce through the gloom. The woman in black let out a choked cry. Her body trembling, she tore off her veil, revealing a face contorted in horror. "No, no, not them," she screamed, her voice raw with fear. John felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that these were not living beings. They were something else, something monstrous, something that belonged to the realm of nightmares. The bus lurched to a halt, the doors hissing open with a finality that sent shivers down John's spine. The cold, damp air rushed in, carrying with it the stench of decay and death. The driver, a cruel smile spreading across his face, turned to face the passengers. "End of the line," he rasped, his voice a chilling echo in the deathly silence. John stumbled off the bus, his legs trembling beneath him. He found himself in a vast graveyard, the tombstones stretching as far as the eye could see, their weathered surfaces etched with the names of the forgotten. The air was thick with the smell of grave dirt and rotting flesh, a nauseating stench that made his stomach churn. The shadowy figures from the mist materialized around them, their eyes burning with malevolent hunger. They were closer now, and John could see them in more detail. Their skin was pale and translucent, their bodies emaciated, their features twisted into grotesque parodies of human expressions. They moved with an eerie grace, their footsteps silent on the graveyard's uneven ground. The old man, his strength finally failing him, crumpled to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The woman in black stood frozen, her face a mask of terror, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored John's own. John, paralyzed by the sheer horror of the situation, could only watch as the creatures closed in, their skeletal hands reaching, their eyes burning with insatiable hunger. One of the creatures, taller and more grotesque than the others, stepped forward. Its skin was stretched taut over its bones, its eyes glowing with an eerie green light. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that glinted in the dim light. "Welcome," it hissed, its voice a grating rasp that sent chills down John's spine. "Welcome to the city of the dead." The words echoed through the graveyard, a chilling pronouncement of John's fate. He knew then that he was trapped in a nightmare, a realm of shadows and death from which there seemed to be no escape. He had boarded the bus to hell, and now he was paying the price. The creatures descended upon the passengers, their skeletal hands tearing, their teeth ripping, their eyes burning with a hunger that could never be satiated. John watched in horror, his stomach churning, as they tore into the old man, their teeth sinking into his flesh, their claws raking his skin. The old man's screams were cut short. replaced by the sickening sounds of tearing flesh and crunching bone. The woman in black, her voice hoarse with terror, screamed and tried to flee. But it was no use. The creatures were too fast, too strong. They caught her, their claws digging into her flesh, their teeth tearing at her throat. Her screams turned into gurgles, then faded into silence as her lifeblood drained away. John, his body fueled by a primal surge of adrenaline, turned and ran. He stumbled through the graveyard, dodging tombstones and skeletal trees, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind him. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to escape. He couldn't let those things catch him. He wouldn't let them. He ran blindly, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. He tripped and fell, scraping his hands on the rough ground. But he scrambled back to his feet and kept running. The graveyard seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of tombstones and shadows. He could hear the creatures closing in, their footsteps echoing behind him, their growls growing louder. He had to find a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. But where could he go? What could he do? John, driven by desperation and fear, stumbled towards a faint glimmer in the distance. As he drew closer, he realized it was a river, its water black and sluggish, its surface reflecting the eerie glow of the city in the distance. The stench of death was overpowering, a suffocating miasma that clung to the air. He peered into the water, his heart sinking as he saw pale, translucent figures floating in the current, their faces contorted in agony, their eyes wide with despair. He realized with a shudder that these were the souls of the damned, trapped forever in this infernal realm, their cries of anguish echoing through the ages. He had to cross the river. He knew it instinctively. It was his only chance of escape, his only hope of returning to the world of the living. But the thought of entering that water, of being surrounded by those tormented souls, filled him with dread. He steeled himself, his fear momentarily overshadowed by a desperate desire to survive. He waded into the icy water, the current tugging at his legs, threatening to pull him under. The souls reached for him, their cold, clammy hands brushing against his skin, their whispers filling his ears, begging him to join them, to give up, to embrace the darkness. Let go, they whispered. Join us. There is no escape. But John resisted. He fought his way through the river, the current growing stronger with every step. He felt himself being pulled under, the whispers growing louder, the darkness closing in. He thrashed against the current, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming. He was losing strength, his vision blurring. Just as he thought he would succumb, a hand reached out and grabbed his arm. John, gasping for air, looked up. A figure stood on the riverbank, its form shrouded in mist, its eyes burning with an eerie red light that seemed to pierce through his soul. The figure was tall and imposing, its features hidden in the shadows, its presence exuding an aura of power and authority. The figure pulled him from the river, its grip surprisingly strong. John collapsed on the bank, coughing and sputtering, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Who are you? He croaked, his voice hoarse. The Guardian, the figure replied, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the graveyard. What What is this place? John stammered, his eyes wide with fear. This is the realm of the forgotten. The guardian said. A place where souls are lost and memories fade. A place where the dead wander and the living are consumed. John stared at the guardian, his mind reeling. He had so many questions. But the words seemed to catch in his throat. He wanted to know why he was here. How he could escape. What would become of him? The guardian seemed to sense his thoughts. You have many questions, it said, and I have answers. But first, you must rest. You are weak and weary. The guardian led John to a small, crumbling mausoleum, its entrance overgrown with vines and moss. Inside, the air was cold and damp. But there was a sense of peace. A feeling of sanctuary. John collapsed onto a stone bench, his body heavy with exhaustion. Rest, the guardian said, and when you are ready, I will tell you what you need to know. John awoke to the sound of dripping water. The silence of the mausoleum broken only by the occasional scuttling of rats in the shadows. He sat up, his body stiff and sore. His mind still reeling from the horrors he had witnessed. The guardian materialized before him, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. You are awake, it said. Tell me, John pleaded. Tell me what's happening. Why am I here? How do I get back? The guardian nodded slowly. The bus. It began, its voice a low rumble. As a conduit, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. It appears only to those who are close to death, offering them a final journey. John felt a chill run down his spine. A final journey? Yes, the guardian said. The driver is a ferryman, a servant of the darkness, charged with transporting souls to their final destination. But I'm not dead, John protested. Not yet, the guardian said. But you were close. The bus chose you. John felt a surge of anger. Why? He demanded. Why me? The guardian remained silent for a moment, its red eyes fixed on John. That is a question I cannot answer, it finally said. The ways of fate are shrouded in mystery. John felt a wave of despair wash over him. He was trapped in this infernal realm, chosen for some unknown purpose, with no way of knowing how to escape. Is there any way to get back? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The guardian nodded slowly. There is a way, it said, but it is perilous. The guardian's words echoed in John's mind as he ventured deeper into the graveyard. Be brave, be strong. Easier said than done, he thought, his hand gripping the hilt of the rusty sword. The graveyard was a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, the air thick with the stench of decay. The creatures lurked everywhere, their eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. He moved cautiously, his senses heightened, every rustle of leaves and creak of branches sending shivers down his spine. He encountered a creature lurking behind a moss-covered tombstone. It lunged at him, its claws outstretched, its eyes burning with a predatory gleam. John reacted instinctively, raising the sword and slashing at the creature. The blade passed through its spectral form, disrupting its essence, and it let out a chilling wail before dissolving into mist. Emboldened by his small victory, John pressed on, his resolve hardening with each step. He fought his way through hordes of creatures, his sword a blur of motion, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He dodged their attacks, his heart pounding in his chest. His every sense focused on survival. He was no warrior, but the primal instinct to survive, to escape this nightmare, fueled his every move. He finally reached the center of the graveyard, where a towering mausoleum stood, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The entrance was guarded by two skeletal warriors, their bony fingers wrapped around rusted swords, their empty sockets glowing with an eerie blue light. John knew he had to defeat them to gain access to the mausoleum. He charged forward, his sword raised, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The skeletal warriors met his attack, their swords clashing against his, sparks flying in the darkness. John fought with a ferocity born of desperation, his every move fueled by a primal desire to live. He parried their blows, dodged their attacks, and countered with his own, his sword finding its mark again and again. The battle was fierce, the air filled with the clang of metal and the chilling cries of the skeletal warriors. But John, driven by his will to survive, refused to yield. He fought until, with a final, desperate lunge, his sword pierced the skull of the last warrior, sending it crumbling to dust. Exhausted but triumphant, John stumbled through the entrance of the mausoleum, the heavy doors creaking shut behind him. He found himself in a vast chamber, the air thick with the dust of ages. The walls were lined with crypts, their stone surfaces adorned with intricate carvings and inscriptions. In the center of the chamber, on a raised platform, sat a small silver casket, its surface etched with strange symbols. John knew instinctively that this was what he had been searching for. He approached the casket, his hand trembling as he reached for the lid. He opened the casket, and inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay the key, a small, silver object that pulsed with an inner light, radiating a warmth that seemed to defy the coldness of the tomb. John picked up the key, its smooth surface cool against his palm. He could feel a power emanating from it, a power that filled him with hope. John clutched the key tightly, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. He had the key to freedom. But his ordeal was far from over. He still had to escape the graveyard, evade the creatures, and find the city gates. He retraced his steps, his senses still on high alert. The creatures were still lurking, their growls echoing through the graveyard. But now, armed with the key and emboldened by his victory over the skeletal warriors, John felt a surge of confidence. He moved with a newfound purpose, his eyes fixed on the distant glimmer of the city gates. He encountered more creatures along the way, but he fought them off with a newfound strength and skill. He used the sword with precision, his movements fluid and efficient. He was no longer a helpless victim, but a survivor, a warrior. He finally reached the city gates, their massive iron bars looming before him. He could see the swirling mist beyond the gates, the ghostly shapes of the creatures moving within. He inserted the key into the lock, his hand trembling with anticipation. The lock clicked open, and the gates swung inward, revealing a blinding white light that seemed to emanate from another world. John hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and stepped through the portal, the light engulfing him, the sound of the graveyard fading behind him. He closed his eyes against the brightness. And when he opened them again, he found himself back at the bus shelter. The rain had stopped. The clouds had parted. And the first rays of dawn were painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. He was soaked to the bone. His clothes torn. His body battered and bruised. But he was alive. He looked around. The familiar surroundings of Oakhaven suddenly precious to him. He could see the diner where he worked. The houses with their neatly trimmed lawns. The church with its white steeple. He took a deep breath. The air sweet and clean. The scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass filling his lungs. He had escaped the realm of the dead. He had survived the ghost bus to hell. Epilogue. John walked home, his steps slow and deliberate. His mind still reeling from the events of the night. He could hardly believe what he had experienced. It felt like a dream. A nightmare from which he had finally awakened. But the scar on his arm, a reminder of his encounter with the creatures, throbbed faintly, a testament to the reality of his ordeal. He touched it, a shiver running down his spine. He was back, but he would never be the same. The experience had changed him, leaving an indelible mark on his soul. He had looked into the abyss. And the abyss had looked back at him. He had seen the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the world. The horrors that awaited those who strayed from the path. He knew he would never forget his journey on the ghost bus. The terror he had endured. The friends he had lost. But he also knew that he had gained something from the experience, a newfound appreciation for life. A deeper understanding of the fragility of existence. And a strength he never knew he possessed. He would carry the memories of his ordeal with him. A constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within and the light that had guided him back to the world of the living. He would cherish every moment, every sunrise, every laugh, every connection, for he knew how easily it could all be taken away. He had faced his fears and emerged from the darkness. A survivor, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And as he walked towards the rising sun, he knew that he would never again take life for granted. He had been to hell and back. And he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more grateful than ever before.